The Perverse Subject of Analysis, Thomas Ogden. Part 2. Clinical Illustration, Through the Looking Glass. Ms. A. began our first session by telling me that she had decided to consult with me because her marriage was a sham. She and her husband had not had sex for more than 5 years. The patient told me that what disturbed her most was that she recently realized that the situation did not bother her. In the past, everything mattered terribly, but now that she was middle-aged, she was 43 years old, nothing seemed to matter. Her 2 children were in their late teens and had recently left home for college. It seemed to me that although Ms. A. was not lying to me during our initial several meetings, there was much more to the story of why she was seeking analysis than she was revealing. This, of course, is always the case, but I had the distinct impression that I was being kept in the dark about rather specific important matters about which Ms. A. was consciously aware. There was something about being with her that reminded me of watching, or in fantasy, being in, a detective movie. In particular, I thought of Jack Nicholson and Faye Dunaway in Chinatown and several movies with Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, the names of which I could not remember. I was intrigued by Ms. A. Her choice of words was imaginative and her way of speaking had a vitality that were at odds with her description of herself as a lifeless, middle-aged woman. In the course of the first year of analysis, Ms. A. told me about her childhood in Southern California. Her father was a real estate developer who very quickly became very wealthy and then was forced into bankruptcy as a result of a series of events that were not clear to Ms. A. The patient's father never let the fact of his past bankruptcy be known to friends and colleagues and kept up appearances for a period of more than a decade while he accumulated an even larger real estate empire than the one he had previously held. Following the rebuilding of his empire, most of Ms. A.'s father's friends, clients, and business partners were people associated with the film industry. Once or twice a month, the patient's parents would hold large parties at their home, events that constituted the center of the life of the family. Both parents seemed continually to be consumed. Ms. A.'s mother devoted herself to the preparations for the next party while the patient's father worked with feverish intensity on his next real estate deal. At these social events at the patient's family's home, there was a great deal of heavy drinking and drug taking. Cross-dressing and flaunting of outrageous homosexuality by some of the guests stood out vividly in the patient's memory. Ms. A. attended most of these parties and said that when she was not pretending to be an adult, she felt invisible, as if there weren't a child present. At times, she felt like a prop in one or another of the guests' displays of his or her sensitivity to children. At other times, she was treated as a mock adult in such a way that she felt that she was the brunt of a joke, the point of which she did not understand. Very often, she felt terribly bored by the sheer predictability of it all. Everyone could be counted on to be perfectly in role. Although the patient did not remember observing or being the object of overt sexual behavior, she said that she felt that there was far too much kissing going on. Ms. A. said that she learned over time that this type of kissing was a social affectation. Nonetheless, it felt yucky to her. The patient described these parties with a thinly disguised sense of pride. She would mention, in passing, names of famous film celebrities who were regular guests at the parties. The image of the patient's parents that emerged from Ms. A.'s description of her childhood was one in which there seemed to be a couple single-mindedly together in the partnership of creating an illusion of being an integral part of an in-crowd of wealthy, glamorous people, while having almost nothing else to do with one another or with their children. The patient's mother suffered from chronic insomnia and other nervous conditions. In order not to disturb the patient's father, she would read during the night in the guest bedroom. It was not openly acknowledged that the parents kept separate bedrooms for virtually the entirety of their marriage. In fact, at the outset of analysis, Ms. A. herself was not fully conscious of her suspicion that her mother's insomnia was very likely a ruse for her parents maintaining separate bedrooms. A good deal of the manifest content of the first year and a half of analysis involved the elaboration of a narrative of the patient's life, particularly her childhood. Ms. A. spoke entertainingly, but left me very little room to comment on what she was saying. There were practically no periods of silence lasting longer than a few seconds. The patient was apologetic about the fact that she was unable to remember her dreams. Ms. A. was not a beautiful woman in a conventional sense, but there was a compelling, subtle sexuality in almost everything she said and did. I looked forward to seeing her each day and enjoyed hearing her stories. The patient met me in the waiting room with a warm smile that conveyed the feeling that she was glad to see me, but was by no means desperately dependent on me. Ms. A. had a youthful independence about her that seemed to invite me to join her in her rebelliousness. She gave the impression that she just happened to be in the neighborhood and decided to drop by. At the same time, the patient adhered to the format of the analytic frame, rarely being late, paying punctually, and addressing me as Dr. Ogden when on the rare occasion she left a telephone message. Persistent fantasies included the idea of my having a serious physical illness, the nature of which she felt I was hiding from her. There were also fears of breaches of confidentiality, for instance, anxiety that I would talk with her husband if he were to angrily accuse me of engaging in an endless analysis for my own benefit or of encouraging the patient to leave him. These fantasies were discussed at length, including the idea that I was not what I appeared to be and the idea that the patient might feel that she was deceiving me in some way. Moreover, the excitement of such a battle over the patient was discussed, as well as the idea of my wishing to steal the patient away from her husband. However, these interpretations seemed mechanical to me. The flatness of these interpretations and the patient's response to them reflected a more general paucity in the analysis of reflective thought. The patient's cleverness and talent in telling an interesting story seemed to serve as a substitute for spontaneous, creative thinking. I similarly felt the need to be clever and noticed that I would occasionally supply the name of a book or a poem that the patient had momentarily forgotten. I attempted to attend to my own reveries, buy-in, 1962, during the session, since I consider this aspect of the analytic experience to be indispensable to the understanding of the transference-countertransference, Ogden, 1989, 1994, B. C. D. 1995. During one of these meetings, the patient was talking about having watched a television program with her husband the previous night. She described how the two of them had sat next to one another on their living room couch in a way that had felt to her like two strangers on a subway train sitting next to one another without the slightest feeling of connection between them. As Ms. A was talking, I found myself thinking about the fact that the attendant in the parking lot immediately next to my office building had begun making preparations to open a car wash in the parking lot. He had recently purchased a commercial vacuum cleaner that made a deafening noise when it was being used. His girlfriend, whom I found to be brassy and abrasive, was helping with the project. I imagined calling City Hall to file a complaint about violations of zoning ordinances concerning noise. Were there such ordinances? How could there not be? Is there nobody at City Hall with whom I could discuss this? There must be some kind of appeals process. I became increasingly anxious as I imagined this unreasonable, unapproachable couple and the bureaucratic maze at City Hall with nobody at the center of it. As I emerged from this increasingly ruminative set of thoughts, feelings, and sensations, I was struck by the intensity of the anxiety that I was feeling. Point 2. I wondered about the parallels between the couple in the parking lot and the patient's parents, each pair with their plans that neither the patient nor I had the power to influence. I hypothesized that the idea of the frightening, disturbing noise of the vacuum cleaner might be related to a fantasy of noise coming from the parent's bedroom, the disturbing noise of an intercourse that was both empty, a vacuum, and consuming, sucking into it the patient's internal object world. My hypotheses concerning the connection between the elements of the reverie and my experience in being with the patient seemed strained and intellectualized. Nevertheless, the reverie left me feeling extremely uneasy and alerted me to the fact that I was feeling disturbed by something that was occurring between the patient and me. In the period of months following the session just described, I very gradually began to recognize a sense of pride that I had begun to take in the idea that other people might know that I was Ms. A.'s analyst. I both took pleasure in this fantasy and felt deeply ashamed of it, and managed to keep it out of conscious awareness almost completely. Ms. A wore a great many different hats, coats, and scarves, and I found myself feeling interested in what she would be wearing to each day's session. As she entered the office, she would lay her coat on the floor next to the couch, almost at my feet. The designer label would often be in view and I would have to strain to attempt to read it, upside down. I should emphasize that since it requires a considerable span of time to describe the experience of a reverie, the rhythm of the analysis is not well represented in my efforts at describing it in a linear fashion. The thoughts, feelings, and sensations involved in a reverie may occupy only a few moments. Consequently, it is inaccurate to think of the analyst's use of his reveries as reflecting a detached, self-absorbed, inattentive psychological state. On the contrary, the analyst's attentiveness to his own affective state as generated in the context of the analytic intersubjectivity contributes to a feeling of intense emotional immediacy and a sense of the analyst's resonance with the patient's unconscious experience in the present moment. Countertransference. 3 feelings that I am describing comprised a silent background that had not yet become a focus of conscious analysis. In other words, these aspects of the analysis had not yet become analytic objects. Buy-in, 1962, Green, 1975, Ogden, 1994, B. C. 1995, i.e., elements of intersubjective experience that were utilizable in the process of generating analytic meaning. Instead, this set of thoughts, feelings, and sensations remained a part of a largely unconscious intersubjective field in which I was, at that juncture, more participant than observer. It is often difficult to say what contributes to a shift in the balance of psychological interpersonal forces that make such background experience available for conscious use as analytic data. In the phase of work under discussion, it was in part a further set of anxiety-laden reveries, in association with the reveries previously described, that allowed aspects of heretofore largely unconscious background experience to begin to be transformed into analytic objects. Initially, my anxiety was diffuse and centered on feeling that I would be forgetful. I experienced a sense of pressure to remember to send a card to a relative whose birthday was approaching. I had changed a patient's appointment time and felt anxious that I would not be there at the correct time. I noticed that these passing thoughts during the session with Ms. A were related to the feeling that there were holes in my consciousness. I wondered what it was that I was blinding myself to in the work with Ms. A. The anxiety was now real and immediate, although non-specific. Its meaning in relation to the leading unconscious transference anxieties was still unclear to me. However, a shift in the quality of my self-awareness in the transference-countertransference was taking place. Over the succeeding weeks of analysis, my anxiety took on increasing specificity. I began to experience anxiety just before the meetings with Ms. A, feeling extremely awkward and self-conscious. Meeting her in the waiting room felt like the beginning of a date. 3. I used the term countertransference to refer to the analyst's experience of the transference-countertransference. As discussed above, the transference-countertransference is understood as an unconscious intersubjective construction experienced separately and individually by analyst and analysand. I do not conceive of transference and countertransference as separable psychological entities that arise independently of or in response to one another, but as aspects of a single intersubjective totality. Lowald, 1986, Ogden, 1994 A.D. Ms. A seemed not to be experiencing anxiety of this sort and, if anything, appeared to be all the more graceful and fluid in her way of carrying herself, speaking, dressing, and so on. It was during this period of analysis that the patient presented the following dream. An old man was sitting in his study reading. It was like your office, but it wasn't actually your office. It was dark and had a dank, seedy feeling to it. People were peering through the window at him. I was one of them. It was terribly important to be perfectly still so as not to be caught. I was afraid I would pee. He seemed like a depressed, dirty old man. I thought he was only pretending to read or forcing himself to read. I also had the feeling that he was trying to turn himself on sexually by reading, but it wasn't working. I'm not sure if I thought this in the dream or as I was waking up, but it felt as if he knew how badly I needed to pee. It was at this point that the very disturbing thought occurred to me that Ms. A must have been watching me watch her. The dream was about the excitement of secretly observing and about being observed in the act of secretly and excitedly watching and about the uncertainty of who was observing whom. She must know that I had tried to read the labels on her coats that she had draped at my feet. How long had she known? I felt intense embarrassment at the idea of having been observed looking. Everything seemed to have suddenly and unexpectedly been reversed. What had been private had become public. What had felt like simple curiosity had become prurient interest. The patient's nonchalance had taken on a feeling of manipulative control. What had felt like intimacy now felt like an experience of having been played for a fool. For a moment, it seemed to me as if a trap had been carefully set and I had sprung it, but I also understood that I had been a part of setting it. My having sprung the trap was not the thing that was the most humiliating part of all this to me. My feelings of embarrassment centered on the idea that I had sprung the trap long ago and had been unaware of it. I felt as if my own looking, which now felt like voyeurism, had been observed at every step. My secret had never been a secret. In addition, there was an intense feeling of betrayal. I could now fully acknowledge to myself for the first time that I had unconsciously felt pride, pleasure, and guilt at having been included in an erotized duet with Ms. A. In the instant of recognition that I am describing, the experience of playing a role in this scene became transformed from an experience in which I had felt like an adult into an experience of myself as caught in the act of being a self-deceiving infant or child. My immaturity had been unmasked. I felt outside of adult sexuality with my nose pressed against the glass as represented in the dream by the patient peering through the window in the dream while experiencing an infantile, urinary, form of sexual excitement. At this juncture, I began to be able to talk to myself in a fuller way about my experience in the transference-countertransference. It seemed that a shared unconscious construction had been created in the analysis through which the patient had been giving shape to important aspects of her internal object world. It appeared that the intense embarrassment that I was feeling represented a disavowed and projected version of the patient's humiliation at finding herself to be an infantile onlooker in relation to her parents' degraded intercourse, which was in part equated with the parties. Less consciously, the parents were felt to be excitedly observing her excitement. I had experienced both the illusion/delusion of being a participant in the parental intercourse and the humiliation of being revealed to be only an infant who was excitedly pretending to be part of the primal scene. Ms. A and I, in the asymmetrically shared experience of this transference-countertransference drama, had each in our own way insisted that we were not the outsider to the parental intercourse, but were really adults participating in it. At this point, I began to understand the patient's dream as reflecting an aspect of Ms. A.'s internal object world about which I had been only subliminally aware. The image of the intercourse in the dream was of a dead intercourse. The old man, simultaneously representing me, the patient's internal world, and the analytic relationship, was depressed and lonely, going through the motions of reading or perhaps attempting to escape his depression by means of solitary, empty sexual excitement. As I emerged from my reverie and subsequent thoughts, I attempted to refocus on what the patient was saying. Of course, I was not returning to a place where we had left off, but to a place that had not previously existed. Ms. A at first spoke about her dream by connecting her perennial fears of my being ill with the fact that in the dream, the illness was a depression. She then said that the dream reminded her of something that had happened in the waiting room at the beginning of the session. She told me that she had looked at me to see if I was tired or sick by checking to see if I had dark circles under my eyes. She had hoped that I had not seen her looking at me in that way. The patient then abruptly changed the topic. I asked her if she had felt anxious when she cut herself off in the middle of her observations and feelings about what she had observed in the waiting room. She said, "I feel all over the place. It felt dangerous to be so specific about looking at you." It seemed to me that the patient was unconsciously attempting, in an anxious and ambivalent way, to talk to me about the dangers of the exciting drama of looking and being looked at that had been enacted in the analysis and which were being depicted in the dream. I said that I thought that Ms. A had experienced herself as being in more than one place at the same time in the dream and perhaps also in the relationship with me. Although she had in part experienced herself as one of the people looking through the window, it seemed to me that she was also identified with the dirty old man in my office and was observing him in the act of excitedly watching her. The connection between the old man and me in the dream was so apparent that I did not feel it necessary to spell it out. I said to Ms. A that she had linked the dream to her having stolen a look at me in the waiting room. I told her that I thought that for some time, she had both wanted me to understand and was afraid that I would understand the importance of a particular type of secretive looking that felt shameful to her. I said that I thought that she was trying to show me in the dream that she felt that an aspect of our relationship involved a kind of excitement that was connected with the experience of secretly looking and being caught in the act of excitedly watching. I chose not to be more specific at this moment about the enactments in the analytic setting in order not to enter into another form of sadomasochistic activity. The interpretation led to a palpable sense of relief on the part of both the patient and myself. Ms. A was silent for several minutes after I made my comments, the first period of extended silence that had occurred in the analysis. During the silence, I felt relaxed in a way that I had not previously felt with Ms. A. The patient then told me that what I had said had made her feel understood, but not exposed, if that distinction makes sense. She said she would have expected to have felt painfully embarrassed by having this aspect of her spoken about by me. She was silent for the remaining few minutes of the session. Ms. A began the following meeting by saying that she had had a dream the previous night. In it she was herself as a child. She woke up in the dream to find that she had polio, a disease about which she had been quite phobic from the time she was a small child. On waking, in the dream, she could not move her legs, nor did she have any feelings in them. She was both extremely frightened and surprisingly calm. She imagined that she would never again be able to move her legs or have sensation in them. The patient said that she felt the dream was a response to what had happened in our session the previous day. She said that the dream had been quiet in a way that reminded her of the silences in our meeting. The feeling in the dream was also a very odd combination of terror and relief connected with the fact that the thing that she had most feared had finally happened. I thought of Winnicott's, 1974, notion that the dreaded event, the fear of breakdown, is an event that has already occurred, but has not yet been experienced. I also thought, but did not say, that the patient's emotional/sensory deadness, paralysis and loss of sensation, was beginning to be acknowledged without immediately being buried in entertaining stories. The silence for the moment, was not being filled with noise. It seemed that the patient was evidencing the rudiments of the capacity to observe and to be able to think about what she was experiencing, i.e., her sense of deadness. There was for now an aspect of her, represented by the sensing/non-paralyzed part of her in the dream, that paradoxically could feel the deadness of another aspect of her and experience the lie, the noise, as a lie. It is not possible in the space of this paper to describe in detail the events of the analysis over the succeeding months and years. The transference-countertransference shift just described was followed by a discussion of the central role in the analysis of the patient's experience of secretly looking at me in a sexually exciting way and her fantasy of secretly, excitedly, dangerously observing me in the act of excitedly observing her. Gradually, in the course of this period of work, details of the acting in, for example, the patient's observing me observe her laying her clothes at my feet, were discussed. Again, these discussions were not conducted in a way that served to create the effect of an embarrassing/exciting undressing of the patient, the analyst, or the analysis. Instead, the predominant feeling was that of the patient's loneliness and hopelessness about ever being able to experience herself as other than a made-up person. Ms. A began to understand the ways in which the elements of the perverse defense had been invaluable in protecting her from an experience of deadness that she had feared would be unbearable. In the course of the analysis, the patient described aspects of her life to which she had previously alluded, but had hardly existed in the analysis as analytic objects, i.e., as events that carried meaning that could be experienced, noticed, considered, and thought about in the context of the network of meanings that were being elaborated. It would be inaccurate to say that these perceptions of past events had been unconscious or had been consciously withheld, rather, these largely unspoken aspects of her life, that will be discussed, had felt so disconnected from the entertaining storytelling that it just never occurred to me to talk about these things. See Freud, 1927, for a discussion of the process of radical psychic disconnection involved in perversion. An analogous form of splitting was reflected in the countertransference experience of being, in the dark, flying blind, and having holes in my consciousness. Over time, Ms. A told me that from the time she was a child, she felt consumed by the need to get people, both boys and girls, men and women, to find her mysterious and sexy. It became a full-blown obsession in high school to get boys to chase her. Everywhere I was and in everything I did, I was looking out of the corner of my eye to see who was looking at me. Ms. A had been extremely promiscuous in adolescence. In high school, she thought of herself as a liberated rebel, but it became distressing over time to feel that she was driven by something that she could not control. Moreover, she was unable to speak to anyone about feeling out of control, which led her to feel intensely lonely. Ms. A attempted to compensate for her sense of isolation by never being alone. She recalled talking with friends in college well into the night until they finally fell asleep, at which point the patient would sleep on their floor. During this period of promiscuity and isolation, the patient was almost completely unable to think or talk with herself or with anyone else about what was happening to her. Instead, what might have become a thought or a feeling was experienced as extreme muscular tension in combination with a variety of psychosomatic illnesses including chronic amenorrhea, dermatitis, and severe headaches. Ms. A said that she was unable to read or concentrate and managed her schoolwork by frequently cheating on exams and plagiarizing the work of other students. The cheating itself became exciting. Ms. A took pleasure in showing off to her friends the risks that she was taking. The patient said that she felt a mixture of shame and pride as she told me about her exploits. She said that what made it easy to be so daring was that I genuinely did not give a shit if I were caught. What could they do to me? Ms. A's choice of words surprised me in that she had not previously used scatological language. I wondered, silently, if she imagined that not having a body that needed to engage in ordinary human functions such as defecation, not giving a shit, would provide her with a way of escaping from the emotional and bodily trap in which she felt caught and in danger of being physically killed. I later suggested, in small bits over several weeks, that Ms. A was indirectly telling me that her defiant claim to be alive, outside of the system, beyond the law and outside of her body, had been for a long time an important way of attempting to protect herself from being taken over by the internal lives of other people. I said that it seemed that she had felt terribly privileged and special while at the same time feeling as if she were ceasing to be anybody. The patient began to recognize the profound confusion that she had felt about whose desire it was that was fueling her wish/need to be at the parties. It no longer seemed possible to separate out in any meaningful way her own desires from those of others. The transference implications of these recognitions were explored, including the confusion about whose sexual excitement was whose in the dream as well as in the transference-countertransference events that had occurred in the analysis. In discussing this set of feelings, the patient became aware of the way in which it had served her defensively to create the illusion that the power to do anything she wished set her apart from everyone else. The anxiety associated with the confusion of not knowing whose desire it was that she was experiencing was somewhat allayed by the illusion that she occupied a different universe from everyone else. Ms. A came to understand that hidden by her sense of power was an unconscious feeling of impotence, paralysis, to think, feel, and behave outside of the terms of her exploits, machinations, and manipulations. Hers was a world of unreflective action and reaction. Ms. A said that there had been periods of her life, especially during the latter years of college, during which she had for brief periods recognized the bizarre nature of the way she was living and felt horrified by it and deeply ashamed of it. Although she had a great many sexual experiences, she felt bored by the sex. During intercourse she felt as if she were watching what was happening in a way that felt like watching a television program that wasn't very interesting. Ms. A at times became disturbingly aware of the inhuman quality of this and other aspects of her life. However, the feeling of despair associated with these moments of self-awareness was short-lived. During the phase of work in which this narrative and set of understandings unfolded, I felt an increasing sense of continuity between the content of Ms. A.'s verbal symbolization and the matrix of the transference-countertransference, Ogden, 1991. The initial years of the analysis had in retrospect been marked by a discontinuity of manifest and latent, of verbal content and experiential context. The manifest and acknowledged aspect of the analytic relationship had been quite disconnected from a troubling, exciting, second narrative that resisted symbolization and instead remained a powerful, erotized, predominantly unconscious, intersubjective construction.